Today we saw King Charles III with his consort Queen Camilla go by carriage from Buckingham Palace to the Palace of Westminster in the heart of London, where a ceremony called the State Opening of Parliament took place. This is a ceremony that usually happens annually and after a general election. Today the King, in this ceremony, opened a new session of the British Parliament. He delivered his speech from the throne, which set out his government's agenda for this next session. This ceremony is rather strange, I suppose, in the modern world, which can be rather dismissive of ceremonies and curious dress that are not immediately understandable. But the state opening of Parliament isn't just an empty piece of medieval flummery. It serves an important function that underlines the curious character of the British constitutional settlement. And in this video I will talk a little about this ceremony and why it happens, how it unfolds, the architectural setting of it, and the symbolism of the robes the King and Queen wear. First, we should begin by exploring what Parliament is and what the King's role is in Parliament. To understand that, we need to go back in history 800 years. The British Parliament is an English institution that can trace its origins back to the reign of King Henry III. King Henry III had the good political sense to involve in his major deliberations and decision-making the great lords of his realm, the barons, the bishops, and some abbots of prominent monasteries. And the meeting of the king and these lords was called the King's Great Council. It was in the reign of his son Edward I that the word Parliament, a word that in Norman French means meeting or discussion, was applied to describe this Great Council. It was in Edward's reign too that the Commons were first introduced into the makeup of this Great Council. Now the Commons in this period didn't mean any old Tom, Dick and Harry, but the gentry, the knights who were a social rung below the barons, and each county in England in the 13th and 14th century was allowed to elect 2 of these knights to be part of the King's Parliament. To them was also added, as time went on, representatives of those who made England prosperous, the merchant and trading classes of the great cities, and several cities, London, Norwich and York among them, were able to send to the King's Parliament a representative from their social elite, called a burgess. As we enter the late Middle Ages, more and more knights and burgesses were sent, and by the Tudor period, the Commons were outnumbering the great lords in Parliament. Parliament in the Middle Ages only met when the King called it, and when there was a major matter to discuss, and it met wherever the King was living. Ordinarily, that was the great Palace of Westminster, and Parliament either met in the palace or in the chapter house of Westminster Abbey. Originally, there was no real division between the Lords and the Commons, but by the Tudor period, they were often meeting separately as 2 houses. The Lords were made up not only of the temporal lords, the barons, but also of law lords, the judges, and spiritual lords, the bishops. The Commons were made up of the knights of the shire and the town burgesses. But in this period there was no universal suffrage for men and women, and the electorate of the Commons was limited. The Commons could include anyone the King chose to appoint to it. Even as late as the reign of King Henry VIII, Parliament only ever met in his presence, and it was only convened when the King needed something done, such as to make him head of the church, or if he needed tax revenue. And in this period, the government of England was still wholly in the King's hands and was exercised through his Privy Council. From the late Middle Ages right through to the present day, Parliament has therefore consisted of these 3 integral elements: the Lords, the Commons, and the Sovereign. In Britain, bills presented for debate in Parliament only become law when all 3 elements of Parliament agree on them. Bills become Acts of Parliament only when the Sovereign gives his assent to them. Now, the balance of power in Parliament has shifted, of course, since the Tudor period. In broad brushstrokes, as time went on, the House of Commons became the major place where power resided. It was reformed in the 19th century, and with universal suffrage in the 20th century, its members were returned by an electorate that now included all people. The Lords, more dominating than the Commons in the medieval and Tudor period, was reformed in the early 2000s and now is just a revising chamber for the legislation introduced by the Commons. The sovereign, who once used Parliament as a way of doing business, now leaves the business to his government, who are mostly now by convention members of the House of Commons. Since 1708, no British sovereign has ever refused to give assent to an Act of Parliament that has been passed by both the Lords and the Commons. A lot of this change has been governed not by legislation, but by political pragmatism in the face of social change. It is perfectly possible for the King to refuse to give assent to a new law, but to do so would set him at loggerheads with those who now wield power on behalf of the people and would cause a constitutional crisis. All of these responsibilities and understandings operate not through legislation, but through a very complex system of conventions that have developed over the centuries. So Parliament is only complete when the three constituent parts of it are all together, the sovereign, the Lords and the Commons, and for some centuries it has only ever appeared in that completeness for the 20 or so minutes of a state opening of Parliament. Of course, in the past, sovereigns not only opened, but they prorogued or closed the session of Parliament too. In fact, British sovereigns continued to prorogue Parliament in person until 1854. Since then, the sovereign has used commissioners to fulfil the action for them. The proroguing of Parliament involved the sovereign agreeing in person to each Act of Parliament passed. Since 1854, the sovereign's assent to each Act has been indicated by one of the clerks of the Lords using the Norman French phrase, unchanged since the 13th century, "Le roi le veut," the king wills it. In Tudor times, Parliament would be addressed directly by the sovereign when it was opened and prorogued, who then, of course, still directly governed the nation. Henry VIII, in his Reformation parliaments in the 1520s and 30s, addressed Parliament to tell them directly what he wanted them to do and achieve for him, including, of course, his supremacy over the Church. Now that power is no longer vested in the sovereign in the same way, but in the government made up of elected members of the Commons, His Majesty's government now set the agenda. And the words of the King's speech, which once would have been directed by his own will, are no longer his own, but his government's. So let's set the architectural scene of this peculiarly British ceremony. The state opening of Parliament occurs in a royal palace, the Palace of Westminster, sometimes called the Houses of Parliament. Up until 1512, when the private apartments of the King burnt down, English kings used Westminster as their primary London residence. When Henry VIII moved out in 1512, he moved first to the Palace of Bridewell in the city, and Parliament went with him, and they met next door in Blackfriars, where the king could keep a good eye on them. When in the late 1520s Henry moved to Whitehall Palace, Parliament then began to meet again next door in the Palace of Westminster. In the reign of King Edward VI, the old Palace of Westminster was given over entirely to the use of the Lords and the Commons, and they started meeting in separate chambers, the Commons meeting in the old Chapel Royal of St Stephen, and the Lords meeting in the medieval Queen's Great Chamber. They met in these spaces until the 19th century, and their administration expanded into different areas of the old palace. If you wonder why the Commons Chamber is arranged as it is, with benches facing one another, that's because the members of the Commons, when they started meeting in the old chapel, simply used the medieval choir stalls to sit in. In 1834, the medieval palace was burnt down, and though some spaces were patched up for the use of the Commons and Lords, the decision was made to replace the old palace with a new building, the present building. This was designed in the Gothic style by Charles Barry and furnished by the Gothic revival architect Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin. The old palace was a disorganised series of apartments that were not designed for the purpose they were being used for. But in the new palace, an attempt was made to rationalise the plan. The Lords' Chamber was finished in 1847, the Commons in 1852, and much of the palace was completed and functioning by 1860. The palace has an axial plan, with the Commons and Lords' chambers opposite one another on an east-west axis. The chambers are separated by long corridors which meet in the middle in a central lobby. An area of the palace was given over, as before, to the sovereign, and these spaces were placed to the west behind the House of Lords chamber. Okay, so let's return now to the present. The sovereign arrives for a state opening of Parliament at what is called the Norman Porch, which is the sovereign's entrance to the Palace of Westminster directly under the Victoria Tower. Today, the King and Queen arrived there in the Diamond Jubilee state coach. The regalia, the imperial state crown, the sword of state and the cap of maintenance that signify the sovereign's authority are borne to the palace in their own carriage procession, and they arrive before the King and Queen. Just inside the entrance is a regalia room, where the regalia are prepared before they're taken up the royal staircase to a space called the Royal Gallery, where they are put on display until just before the sovereign arrives. Just before the sovereign arrives, the Lord Great Chamberlain, who is responsible for this royal part of the palace, removes the crown to the adjoining robing room. When the King and Queen arrived, they made their way up the royal staircase and turned immediately right at the top, where they entered the robing room, which is an enormous space with a chair of estate placed at one end. Now, with TV glare, we see the King and Queen arrive and walk up the stairs without their robes on. And the robing room is designed to have two entrances, one from the stairs and another from the Royal Gallery, so that the King and Queen could enter privately and then emerge into the Royal Gallery robed. The robes we saw the King and Queen wear today were completely traditional and followed former precedent. The King was wearing the uniform of an Admiral of the Fleet. He was also wearing the sash of the Royal Victorian Order, of which he is sovereign, and the collar of the Order of the Garter. Now, you might imagine he would wear the sash of the Order of the Garter or the Order of the Thistle, but King Edward VII in 1901 began the precedent of wearing the Victorian Order sash at state openings, and that has been continued by all the male sovereigns since. Over his uniform, the King wore the crimson velvet robe of state, the parliamentary robe, which he wore as he entered Westminster Abbey for his coronation. This robe, lined in ermine and trimmed with miniver, has 3 bands of gold lace on it, and was made in 1937 for his grandfather King George VI. Over it he wore a collar of the Order of the Garter. He wore, of course, the imperial state crown, which as the personal crown of the sovereign is always worn when the king appears in state. The dress the king was wearing has little changed since the late Middle Ages. He wore precisely what Henry VIII wore when he opened his parliaments. In times past, the king would also have carried, at the state opening, the sovereign sceptre and the orb, but this practice seems to have stopped sometime in the 18th century. Now, just a quick note on the term state and what it means. I've mentioned this before in past videos. The term refers to the king's appearance on this occasion. He is dressed in garments that express the fullness of his kingly status. The Queen was robed according to precedent too. She was wearing her coronation dress. Now, at her coronation, as she arrived at the Abbey, the Queen wore the remade state robe of her mother-in-law, Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. However, today she was wearing what I believe is an entirely new state robe. The gold lace on it is very fresh and bright, and the train of the robe is much shorter than that of Her late Majesty's state robe. The King and Queen process through the Royal Gallery towards the House of Lords. Such processions were common in the medieval and Tudor periods, but were revived again in this context for Queen Victoria. The processional route was lined by the Yeomen of the Guard, the oldest military corps in the British Army, who before the opening of Parliament performed their traditional search of the cellars below the palace, just in case someone tried again to repeat what Guy Fawkes attempted in 1605. The royal procession through the gallery included prominent members of the political establishment, the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord President of the Privy Council, and members of the royal household. The heralds of the College of Arms led the procession, as they do on many state occasions, and then directly before the King walked the Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, and the Lord Great Chamberlain, the Lord Carrington. Until relatively recently, the Earl Marshal and the Lord Great Chamberlain would walk backwards in this procession before the sovereign. The Royal Gallery leads to a room called the Prince's Chamber, in which is a large statue of Queen Victoria. The name of this space reflects a chamber with the same name that was the primary royal annex to the House of Lords in the Old Palace. The House of Lords chamber is entered by the King and Queen through two doors which are set on either side of the royal throne. The throne itself, designed by Augustus Pugin, is extraordinarily elaborate. A Gothic canopied reimagining of a medieval throne, it is 10 times more elaborate than any throne an English medieval king sat on. Raised on steps and with a towering canopy, within it are 2 throne chairs, also designed by Pugin, one for the king and one for the queen. The one of the queen is slightly lower than that of the king. Once settled in his throne, the king indicated that the House of Commons should be summoned to the Lords to hear his speech. The Lady Usher of the Black Rod, one of the members of the royal household responsible for the palace, is sent to the Commons to summon them. Now, no king has set foot in the Commons chamber since 1642, when King Charles I entered the chamber to arrest 5 members of the Commons. And in token of their independence since, as Black Rod, the King's messenger, arrives at the door of the Commons, it was slammed in her face. After she knocked 3 times on the door with her rod, she was allowed to enter and summon the Commons to the Lords. Now, the Commons are not allowed any further into the Lords than what is called the bar of the House, just within its entrance, and the Commons Speaker, with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, stand before it to hear the speech, surrounded by other members of Parliament. As the speech was read by the King, outlining modern policies for a modern world, the past seems to meet the present in a very tangible way. The ceremony of the state opening of Parliament is not simply a bit of pointless theatre, but reflects symbolically the reality of how the different parts of the British polity all function and relate to one another. It is a ceremony that reflects the great continuity of the British Parliament, and a fixed point of continuity is perhaps not a bad thing in a rapidly changing world where nothing seems certain. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.